Hi, so I'm Twyla Bolte. I am current Bemidji Jaycee's treasurer. I'm also past Jaycee president, Bemidji Jaycee president. And I have with me this evening Superintendent Tim Lutz, who is here to share with us some information about the school referendum coming up on the vote November 2nd, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
So he is here to share some information with us, and so you guys have all the information you need. So thank you for coming.
Absolutely, thank you, Twyla, for this opportunity to speak to the Jaycees and to just explain a little bit about how and why we are in the situation we're in with the school district. And I should say that my goal this evening is to explain how school finance works in Minnesota and to explain basically what we're asking in this referendum. But first, I would like to point out that our goal, as you can see from this first slide, is to secure our school district's financial future. And that's really important for the sake of our school system, for our students, and for our community, because a strong community comes about through a strong school system. They're connected. So, and before I really get into my presentation, I want to thank everybody who works together to make our school system what it is. Parents, students, teachers, the community, all working together to make sure we have a strong school system for our students, our future generation. So what this is about is building on our successes. We have a lot of wonderful success stories in our school system. And there are 6 examples right here for you to explore and take a look at. Last year when I made these presentations, I had another slide. I could probably have 5 more slides that talk about our school system's success stories, the cutting edge career academies, our music programs, our sports and other activities that often go to the state for competition. We have great programs and we want to build on those successes. So how did we get here? What's our story and why are we asking for a referendum? In order to do that and to explain how we got here, I have to explain a little bit about school finance in Minnesota. 60% of our revenue, our funding, comes from the state of Minnesota in the form of what's called a per pupil formula. That per pupil formula is what we receive for every student who's enrolled. Now remember that number 60%, because that number is going to come back and haunt us, if you will, a little bit later on in the next slide or two. 5 or 6% of our funding comes from the federal government. 12 or 13% comes from local funds in the form of a bond referendum and another current operating referendum. And then the rest of the funding comes from the state of Minnesota, but it comes from different sources for different purposes. But remember that 60%. Now, how does the state support education? Every biennium, the state legislature meets and discusses how much school systems should receive. The legislature tries to help school systems keep up with inflation, so they try to give school systems 1 to 2% of an increase every year in order to keep up with inflation. The problem is that when we receive a 2% increase, let's say, that 2% applies to that 60% of our budget. It doesn't apply to our entire $70 million budget. We receive 2% of 60%. So that's essentially really a 1.2% increase. Whereas inflation, if that's 2%, it impacts our entire expense budget. Our expense budget, $70 million, if that's 2% inflation, hits that by about $1.4 million in additional expenses. But if we receive 1.2% of revenue, we receive about $750,000. So you can see we fall backwards every year. We take in $750 new dollars, but we spend almost twice that. It's hard to keep up and to have a stable budget when that happens. And we're not alone. About 40 other school districts in Minnesota are going out for an operating referendum this year. And that's one of the reasons, not keeping up with inflation. Now this slide shows how the state legislature has supported education and school districts since 2008. Most years, we receive a 2% increase. Some years, as you can see on the left side of the screen, are pretty lean years they've been. This year, we received a 2.45% increase. But again, when you see those percentages, they all apply to just 60% of our budget, roughly. So as you can see in the blue box there, accounting for inflation, school districts like Bemidji are going backwards every year. So that's one of the reasons why we, along with 40 other school districts, are asking for local support. Another reason, states in this country operate education. States are mandated and are constitutionally mandated to provide funding for their school systems. But states, like Minnesota, are not required to fully fund the mandates that are demanded of schools. Special education and transportation are two of the biggest examples of areas that we call underfunded mandates. Every year in Bemidji area schools, we lose about $4.5 million, at least for the last few years that's been the case, because funding is not enough to keep up with this expensive program. Special education requires specialists and lots of equipment. It's expensive. And so when we have to recover from that loss, we have to pull from our reserves, or our savings account, if you will, to pay for that $4.5 million. Transportation is another example. For the last 3 years, we have lost an average of $750,000 in our transportation. Now, the state of Minnesota provides a formula of a little more than $450 per student for riding on buses. That formula works great in metro communities and school districts where there are lots of high populations of families and students living in apartment buildings or in tightly packed neighborhoods. But it's not that way in Bemidji. Let me show you what our map looks like here in Bemidji. This is our school district and its boundaries. And if you look at that area highlighted in yellow, you can see that as we overlay our map over the metro area, we stretch from Albertville in the northwest all the way south to Shakopee, east to Rosemount, and then up a little northeast to Stillwater. Our boundaries are 825 square miles. That's 2/3 the size of Rhode Island. Rhode Island is 1,214 square miles. So you can see that we're really large. You can see in the middle here, there's a little square box. That box is surrounding the city of Bemidji. This is Bemidji in here. But this box represents the school district of Richfield. That school district is no larger than the city of Bemidji proper. They have such a small area that the formula for transportation works for them, but not for Bemidji, where we drive over 80 buses every day across 825 square miles for a total of about 1.2 to 1.3 million miles every year. And that's why we struggle with our finances in Bemidji, another example. And I haven't even started to talk about food service, which is another area where we struggle and have to cover our expenses. So let's change gears a little bit and talk about how we use the funding that we do receive. I'm really happy to report that over 90% of our funding goes into educational services, goes right to students, their learning and their growth. You can see in the top left our transportation slice of the pie, 6.45%. That's one of the highest percentages among school districts our size. In the top right, 3.17% is our district level administration. Our coordinators, our directors, and our principals and assistant principals. one of the lowest percentages in the state. So we try very hard to keep our funding directed to students and to the classroom. Now I would like to talk a little bit about what's called ESSER dollars. These are federal funds that we have received to help us cope with the many funding losses we've experienced during COVID. ESSER 1 was a chunk of money that we were given to help pay for all of the expenses associated with distance learning when this pandemic first started. Purchasing PPE, purchasing computers and Chromebooks for students who were distance learning, and maintaining staff during that time. We still had bus drivers, we still had to use drivers to deliver meals and to deliver homework for many students who couldn't do online learning because of technology issues where they lived. ESSER 2 was another chunk of money that we were given, and that was again for purposes of being able to backfill a lot of the finances that we lost, a lot of the revenue we lost because of students we lost during the pandemic. Many students simply stayed home. And then finally, ESSER 3 is good for the next 3 years, and we're supposed to use those dollars to help with learning loss recovery, mental health issues, and again, retaining and paying for our staff members. All of these funds have strings tied to them and must be used for the purposes they have been designed. I liken these funds to an insurance policy. If you total your car, which is 7 or 8 years old, an insurance policy will help you recover from the costs, but it will not give you the full amount of a brand new car. This is what these ESSER dollars are doing. They're helping us recover as a school district, and they're giving us the opportunity to buy time in terms of what we need to cover and pay for during this pandemic. Now, switching gears again, about 2 or 3 years ago, we saw the writing on the wall, and we realized that our revenue, which is the blue line, was not keeping up with our expenses, the red line on top. And we saw that by the year 24-25, we would have about a $3.5 million deficit. So we decided we needed to go out for an operating referendum. But unfortunately, last year, our messaging couldn't be properly given throughout the community because everything was shut down. And we had to meet virtually all the time. And our messaging kind of got drowned out by all of the other elections that were taking place. I even had people tell me they had no idea. They hadn't heard that we were doing a referendum. So it didn't pass, we weren't successful. And we sat back and we looked at this graph again and realized we're still looking at this gap. Now fortunately, ESSER dollars will buy us maybe another year, so that gap stretches out to maybe the year 25-26, but it's still going to be there, and we're still facing a serious financial problem. So we decided we had to try one more time. We simply couldn't not go out for another referendum. Now, before I get into that story, I want to point out this slide here, which is perhaps the most salient slide, an important slide to talk about in this presentation. If you look at the green dashed line on the bottom, that line represents the funding we have received every year since 2003 from the state of Minnesota in that per pupil funding, that 60% I was talking about earlier. Last year, that funding was $6,567 for every student enrolled in our school system. Now the line here on top represents what we should have received if the state of Minnesota had kept up with inflation. A difference of $639, which is a tremendous amount per student. When you multiply that times an average of 4,800 students, that would have represented over $3 million for our school district last year, and the year before, and the year before that. We could have spent this money last spring and avoided a lot of our cuts. We cut $4 million last year. I can't imagine all the good things and all of the teachers and paraprofessionals and programs we could have kept if we simply have that amount of money last year. So, our issue is not because we're carelessly spending money, it's because we're not seeing the revenue coming in. So what can school districts like ours do to eliminate budgets and eliminate deficits and stabilize the budget? One of the things we can do is try to increase the money we receive from the state. The problem with that, though, is that this upcoming year is a bonding year, so there's not going to be much money for school districts. So we could also take a look at reducing expenditures. That's what we did last year and the year before and for many years prior. There's not much left to cut. So that leaves us with really the only viable option, which is an operating levy and asking our local taxpayers for some help. Now, I want to point out that we have an existing small operating levy. There are two kinds of levies. Bond levies, which cover the costs of building projects like Gene Dillon School, and operating levies, which help school districts operate. This is an operating levy. It's 6 years old. There are 4 years left before this expires. You can see how it compares to these other 4 school districts of Moorhead, Alexandria, Faribault, and Winona. We try to keep our taxes lower, but this is going to run out in 4 years. And when it does, we'll be in even more difficult trouble financially. So as we contemplated another round at a referendum, we reached out to the community. We sent out over 10,000 surveys to over 10,000 people, and we asked our community how much of an appetite they would have for another referendum, or whether or not we should make more cuts instead. And I was very pleased with the response. You can see on the left on this bar graph, 59% of the entire respondents said, please don't make any more cuts. Explore another operating levy. 73% of our district staff, 65% of all parents, and 49% of people who don't have any children in the district. This was a response from over 3,000 people who sent these surveys back, 18% response rate, which is really good. So we saw this as support for moving forward with another operating levy. Then we asked, how much would this community be willing to support? Would this community support a $360 per student levy, which would bring in about $750,000 every year for 10 years? Or would it support a $460 per student levy, which would bring in $1.5 million? Or a $560 per student levy, which would bring in a little over $2 million? And again, we were pleasantly surprised and pleased that 36% of all respondents said they could get behind a $560 levy, the higher amount. Another 25% said they could get behind a $460 levy, which is what we asked for last year. So if you add up these two, 36 and 25, that means that 61% of our respondents said that they could get behind at least this $460 levy. So we thought again that that was support for moving forward, and that's how we set the amount for this levy. So a lot of people told me last year they were a little bit confused by the ballot question. So I would like to lay it out in layman's terms. If you remember, I talked about that existing $180 levy, which is going to expire in 4 years. We don't want to pass a levy this year and then have to go back out to the community in 4 more years and ask to renew that one. Because people are going to say, really, we just passed a levy. You want us to do another one? So it's really logical, it makes sense if we do this. We're asking in the ballot question if we can sunset this current 6-year-old levy, then bring it back for a fresh 10 years and add $280 more per student for a total of $460. And that is the question on the ballot. Will we allow a $460 10-year operating levy to take place in our community. Now, I've talked about that $180 per student levy. We also have a bond levy, which is what built Gene Dillon. These are referred to as voter-approved levies. This is what taxpayers pay on a $150,000 home. It's $342.48. Our two voter-approved levies, when compared to other school districts, are fairly low. Again, we do try to keep our costs down in our school district and community. So, what does this mean for your taxes? I want to point out that when I talk about a $460 levy per student, that's not your taxes. Your taxes are less than that. On an average home of $200,000, let's say right here, you are currently paying on that $180 levy $57.74 a year. Not a month, but a year. That's less than $5 a month. If the levy passes, the referendum goes through, that rate will go up about $90 to $147 and change. That amounts to less than $8 a month. Or, if we look at it on a per diem basis, 26 cents a day. Now, I don't want to minimize raising taxes, but I would like to point out that if we spread this out amongst our community, it literally is pennies a day in order to bring in about $1.5 million for our community. Now, what happens if the operating levy doesn't pass? Last year we didn't focus on this very much because to me it felt like making threats or doom and gloom. But as we were making cuts this past spring, a lot of people said, if you go off for a levy again, please make sure you communicate what could happen if it doesn't pass. And these are some of the considerations we made this spring when we made cuts, looking at larger class sizes, closing a school, reducing activities, charging more for activity fees, longer bus routes, and those are all considerations that we'll have to look at again if the levy doesn't pass. This is what we cut last year. We cut Central Elementary, which is a picture right here, the community education building. Both are gone. 27 teachers, which is like, cutting 27 teachers in terms of economic impact is like closing a small business in town. Now, fortunately, we were able to bring some of those teachers back thanks to those ESSER dollars, so we were grateful for that. But these are some of the items that we had to cut last spring, and that was not very enjoyable, and it wasn't fair to our students. If the referendum is successful, this is what we can look at. We hope to keep our class sizes manageable, to keep our class offerings, keep every school open, continue our extracurricular activities, and more. About $15 million over 10 years is really something that will stabilize our budget. So finally, a reminder to everybody that the vote is on November 2nd. There are different combined polling places. The election takes place from 2 to 8, not the normal hours, from 2 to 8. However, we are offering early voting, and I encourage everybody to get out and come down to the district office at 502 Minnesota Avenue Northwest, just a block and a half up from the old Carnegie Library, and vote. It takes literally 3 minutes to register to vote and then to vote. It's very convenient, and we do offer early voting during business hours, 8 to 4:30, every weekday through the end of November 1st. And I would invite you, if you're interested in helping out, to consider sharing our district's objectives with friends and family and neighbors, explaining to people what you've learned today about why we're in this situation, that it's about not keeping up with inflation, and it's about underfunded mandates, which really take a toll on school districts in Minnesota. And if you would like, feel free to invite me to come to additional meetings where maybe you're a member of another civic group. I'm happy to come out and meet with people and ask how you can help. We have several committees. We only have 2 weeks left, but if you're willing to help, give me a call and I'll be very happy to put you to work. So, summarize, We are needing an operating referendum to be successful, to stabilize our budget here in Bemidji. And it's not an issue of deliberately misspending or carelessly spending our dollars. It's not a spending problem. It's a shortage of revenue issue. And we do our best to be conservative and to be fiscally responsible, but we have a lot of mandates that are asked of us, and we simply can't keep cutting our way to success. We need support from local individuals in our community. If you have any questions, here's how you can contact me. Don't hesitate to reach out at my email address, timlutz@isd31.net, or my phone number, 333-3100. I'm always happy to visit with you about our efforts with the referendum or anything else in our school district. Thank you for this opportunity to share with you about our operating referendum.